Welcome to the next module on contact tracing and case investigation. My name is Rachel Willard Grace. I am the director of the UCSF Center for Excellence in Primary Care. And one of the things we specialize in at our center is a set of skills called health coaching. It's often used within the field of healthcare in regard to chronic disease or combating addiction. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the relevance of these skills to the work that you will be doing as contact tracers or case investigators. By the end of this session, we hope that you will be able to describe why these skills matter and to use several of these skills in practice. These are going to be skills such as ask till ask and closing the loop, which are there to reinforce techniques about COVID-19, our knowledge about COVID-19 and prevention strategies during the course of an interview. We'll be talking about the use of something called action planning to support successful quarantine planning. And we'll talk about successfully conducting the contact tracing or case investigation phone script using a variety of scenarios and using the principles of cultural humility, ask, tell, ask, closing the loop, and action planning. Now, in the previous module that Wanda Jackson delivered on starting the conversation, she introduced this idea of a health coaching toolbox, and she talked about the first tool within that toolbox, setting the agenda. In this session, we'll be talking about 4 additional tools. We're going to start with 2 that are known as ask, tell, ask, and closing the loop. In order to reinforce the value of those skills, I would first like to show you ask, tell, ask, and closing the loop done poorly.
Close contact with someone who has COVID-19. And even though you feel well now, it is possible that you're also infected. It can take 2 to 14 days to show symptoms, so we may not know for up to 14 days if you are infected or not. Because of this, it's important that you quarantine for 2 weeks so that you don't pass on the infection to anyone else.
Seriously? For 2 weeks?
I'm afraid so. The best ways to prevent spreading the virus are to restrict all activity and separate yourself from all others. You should stay home, postpone all non-essential medical visits, and use a separate room and bathroom in your home if possible. You should avoid having visitors over, or handling pets, or caring for children, or preparing food for others. Do you have any questions?
I can't do all that.
So what I'd like to ask is that you take a moment and think about 2 questions. The first question, how do you think this contact is feeling? The second question, do you believe that this contact is going to successfully quarantine for the next 14 days? In this scenario, I'd like to point out that the contact tracer making this call presented correct information, and they presented it in a way that was attempting to be friendly to the contact. However, there are several key things we're going to focus on in this conversation that we believe we can improve. First, the contact tracer in this call did not ask permission to share what was ultimately a lot of information. They assumed that the contact started with no information, and so they gave a large amount of essentially recommendations. And the contact in this case ended up feeling fairly overwhelmed. Let's talk a little bit about what the alternative to this conversation is. We talk first about the skill of ask, tell, ask, and we'll define that skill as a client-centered way to assess and build on what people already know and what they're already motivated to do. When we think about ask, tell, ask, we're thinking about 3 steps. Step 1, we ask using an open-ended question to understand more about a contact's perspective and their knowledge. Now, when we use the word open-ended question, we're talking about a question that invites a story. It is a question that cannot be answered with a yes or a no, but instead asks someone to describe more about their situation or what they already know. Step 2, we tell only that information that the contact does not already know. In order to do that well, it means we have to listen carefully to what the contact's saying rather than just thinking about the next thing we're going to say. Step 3, we're going to ask another question that is called closing the loop. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But to illustrate the difference in this conversation simply from starting with an open-ended question, I'd like to replay that same conversation using the skill of ask, tell, ask, and then we'll examine what looks a little bit different with this.
Close contact with someone who has COVID-19, and even though you feel well now, you could be infected. It could take 2 to 14 days to show symptoms. So for the next 2 weeks, we are asking you to do something called quarantine. Would it be okay if we talk about quarantine?
Okay.
What do you know about quarantine?
Well, I guess it means I should stay home and not have visitors over.
That's a good start. Staying at home and keeping a distance between you and other people in the house is the most important thing you can do. May I share a few other important actions to take?
Yeah, of course.
You should use a separate room and bathroom in your home if possible, and avoid sharing household items like towels and utensils. We also encourage people to avoid handling pets or caring for children and preparing food for others. So what do you think about all of that?
It's a lot to take in.
We can talk about more what it looks like for you and if we might have any resources to help. Before we do, I want to be sure I don't miss anything important. You've covered a lot of information. Would you mind describing in your own words what quarantine includes?
Well, in addition to not going out, I should stay away from the other people in my home and not share items with them or prepare their food.
Exactly. How does all that sound to you?
Now, the question I'd like to pose to you as you watch this is, what do you think the difference is between the conversation we watched before and the one that we watched now? And do you now think that this contact is likely to successfully quarantine? One thing I'd really like to point out is a lot of the information that was shared was the same information. However, the tone of the conversation was very different. The contact tracer, first asked permission. Would it be okay if we talk a little bit about quarantine and what that means for you? The contact tracer then started by understanding what the contact already knew about quarantine and isolation. And then they built on that knowledge. The contact tracer also asked open-ended questions to understand how the contact was feeling. What do you think about all that? And finally, the contact tracer ended with a question to understand how the contact had interpreted the new information. We're going to talk a little bit more about that last question now. The last question is what we call closing the loop. And closing the loop can be defined as asking contacts or cases to restate information that we've shared in their own words. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of saying in their own words. We're not looking for people to parrot or repeat information. We're looking for what people have understood after they take it in and they process it and they think about it in their own world, in their own lives. Now, closing the loop is a great tool to understand how people have understood what we've said, but it's not only that. For those of you who are familiar with adult learning theory posits that we remember actually remarkably little of what we hear or what we read, or even what we hear and read at the same time. In fact, it estimates that we remember about 5% of what we hear in a lecture. Only about 10% of what we hear reading, or maybe 20% of what we hear and read at the same time. But we remember 75% of what we actually practice or do, and 90% of what we teach to others. When you ask someone to close the loop, you are asking them to teach you the information that you've shared with them. So closing the loop is not simply a tool to understand how someone's understood information. It actually is the glue that makes it stick. Now, how do we do that? Well, health coaches recommend a number of different phrases For example, they often will say something like, just to be sure I explained that well, would you mind telling me in your own words? Or, we covered a lot of information. Starting today, what will you be doing? Now notice that these phrases place the onus on the contact tracer or case investigator. If the contact didn't A few other phrases that I've heard from contact tracers and case investigators are things such as, I know I talk quickly, or I want to be sure I didn't miss any key points. Would you mind sharing back with me in your own words what you'll be doing in order to follow a quarantine? Now, here are a few things that health coaches recommend not using or recommend avoiding. Things such as, do you understand what I said? Repeat back what I just said. Or what did I just tell you? Phrases like these sound like a pop quiz, and the purpose of closing the loop is not to quiz the contact or the case. It is to ensure that we have done a good job of explaining information well. So let's revisit and put it all together and revisit the idea of ask till ask. So it might sound something like this. We might ask, what do you know about how to stop the spread of COVID-19? We might then tell the person information that they didn't share with us. You're correct, wearing a mask and staying at home more often is very important. May I share a few other ways that we know help to slow the spread of COVID-19? And finally, we ask another question to close the loop or understand how people have taken in the information in their own words. Just to be sure I explained that well, would you mind telling me in your own words? Now, for many of you who are working in the field of contact tracing and case investigation, you are often following a script. So I want to talk about where this fits within a contact tracing or case investigation script. Anytime you see a giant page of information and bullet points that you're trying to convey to someone, think about ask till ask and closing the loop. So the contact tracing script might have a lot of information about COVID-19 and how it's spread and how to prevent the spread. So when you see that in your mind, that should trigger the question, what do you already know or what have you heard about COVID-19? Let's move on to the second skill, that of action planning. Once again, let's start with a conversation that's going poorly.
Okay, now that we have talked about your symptoms and exposures, I'm going to create an action plan for you to quarantine for 2 weeks starting now.
Okay.
Don't go out at all, even to the store. Stay in a separate room from other people in your house and don't come in contact with them.
Really?
Have someone bring food to your door at meal times. And tonight, tell your spouse that they will have to take care of the kids.
You've got to be kidding.
You'll get a text every day to see how you're feeling.
In this scenario, the contact tracer is trying to be helpful by helping the contact come up with a plan. But how do you think this contact is feeling right now? And again, how likely are they to successfully quarantine? What most people watching this clip say is not at all that this is a terrible example of connecting with and supporting a client. The contact tracer in this scenario doesn't check to see what the contact considers to be their main challenge or what kind of help they desire in order to be able to plan for quarantine. As a result, they make plans that don't necessarily fit within the context of this contact's lives and don't respect their own expertise in their lives. Once again, let's talk about the alternative to this. When we talk about action planning, we're talking about helping a contact to create a specific short-term activity that will take people one step closer to meeting a larger goal. Action planning comes into play when people feel overwhelmed, when they see a giant task ahead of them, such as a 14-day quarantine, and they don't know where to start to be successful. Action planning is helping them come up with these plans and the first step to realizing those plans. The first step of action planning is to have the contact choose. We always start by asking permission to go into this conversation. We're intruding on someone's home and their own home life and their own expertise when we start into the world of action planning, and we need to be invited into the house. We might ask something like this. It sounds like you're worried about how to take care of your parents. Would it be okay to talk about that? The next step is to get a menu of options on the table for the contact to choose from. Now, what I often hear in practice is contact tracers or case investigators saying things such as, why don't you just do X? You should try Y. I recommend Z. Now, if you find that someone is essentially slapping down your ideas over and over, watch for that pattern. Make sure you are not trying to come up with the solutions yourself, because that's often a symptom of our trying to impose a simple solution on someone's complex world and problems. Rather than that approach, what we want to encourage you to do is to help them get a menu of options on the table. I like to start by asking what the person is already thinking about. What do you think some of your options are for making sure they can get groceries at this time? They may already have the wheels turning in their head. They may already be thinking about a variety of potential strategies. When someone is stuck, when they don't have an idea about what they might want to consider, then you can also share options, and ideally share options of what other people do to solve a similar challenge. So we might say something such as, would it be okay if I share with you some ideas that have worked for other people who have been trying to take care of their parents while they quarantine? Step 2. As someone selects an option that may work, that they think they want to try to pursue, we want to ask questions to get much more specific, including when they're going to do that. So we might ask questions such as, what is the most important thing to do first? Who might be able to help you with that? When would you be able to do that? Or how could you do that? What we're trying to do is get someone to really think about how this is going to fit into their plans and their next actions. Step 3, we love the use of a confidence ruler. Now, this is a tool that feels a little bit artificial to some people, but I encourage you to try it out in your life and your practice to see how it fits for you, because it can be very useful in making plans and understanding how realistic something really is for someone. When we use a confidence ruler, we start with the question, let's do a reality check on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all confident and 10 is completely confident. How confident are you that you will be able to carry out this plan? When someone says something like, I think about a 5, we might ask, what might it take, or what would we have to change about this plan to get you to a 7 or an 8? We ideally would like to hear them at about a 7 or an 8. If we're not hearing that, it means most likely we need to make some kind of change to the plan, or think about what kind of support is needed for them to feel confident that they're going to be able to do this action. Step 4, whenever possible, ask about follow-up. So in some jurisdictions, you'll have the opportunity to call someone back and check in on them. That is an incredibly powerful tool when you can do it. So if you've made a plan with someone to call a sibling for help with getting groceries, for example, saying, do you mind if I check in with you in a day or two and see how that's going, can be incredibly helpful, both to make someone feel supported and to encourage them to take the action that they just said they wanted to take. When you do not have the option of following up yourself, you might ask who could play that role in their life. Step 5, once again, we're coming back to this idea of closing the loop. We've talked about a lot of information and plans today. Would you mind describing your next steps in your own words? So let's put that all together, those 5 steps, and see what action planning looks like done the right way.
It sounds like feeling lonely is one hard thing about quarantine. What else is challenging about it? For example, some people have living situations that can make it challenging.
Well, I'm concerned about getting food. I'm unemployed and I don't have money for takeout every day.
Should we make an action plan together to figure out how you can get food?
Yes, let's do that.
What are your options for getting groceries for the 2 weeks?
I could ask my brother for help. He'd definitely bring some groceries and some of my sister's rice and beans if I asked.
That's a great idea. And what's the first step to make that happen?
I could text him.
Perfect. And when do you think you can text him?
I'll do it tonight.
And when your brother comes, how can you get the food without coming into contact with him?
Oh, right. Well, I can have him leave things at my door and not come inside.
Excellent. Let's review how confident you are about this plan. On a 0 to 10 scale, with 10 being very confident, how confident are you that this action plan will work?
It's a 10. I know it will work.
Before we get off the phone, I know that we talked about a lot of things today, and to make sure that we're on the same page, would you mind describing what your action plan is?
I have to stay home for 2 weeks and avoid exposing others in my home.
That's correct. And what will you do tonight?
I'll text my brother to see if he can leave some groceries on my doorstep.
That sounds great. I want to thank you for what you are doing to keep your community safe.
In this scenario, the contact tracer was once again trying to support the contact in making a plan to observe a quarantine. But notice the steps that she used in this case. Step 1, she let the contact choose what the plan was, or encouraged the contact to choose that plan. And she began by asking permission to even talk about it with him. In step 2, she asked questions to get more specific about the plan. She asked the contact, for example, when will you do that? What is the first step? And what could you do to make sure you don't come in contact with your brother when he comes to drop off the food? In step 4, she used the confidence ruler to check and make sure that this was a realistic plan for this contact. And finally, in step 5, she closed the loop with the contact and ensured that the contact was able to describe in his own words what the plan was. Once again, let's return to the idea of the script as a contact tracer or case investigator. When might you use a skill such as action planning? So anytime you reach a point where the contact needs to take an action that is complex or difficult, that's a great time to start thinking about action planning. Whether they are seeking to get testing, whether they're trying to address needs such as getting food or walking a dog or arranging childcare, whatever that action may be, that's a good time to check in and see if they could use support around action planning. In this case, during a referral for testing, the contact tracer might start by saying, it sounds like one of the big concerns in your mind right now is arranging transportation for your son while you're in quarantine. Would it be helpful to talk through your options together? And that's the lead-in to action planning. As our last set of skills today, I'd like to talk about an area that we think of as addressing motivation. One of the most common worries that I hear on the part of contact tracers or case investigators is how to speak with someone who's not interested or not motivated. And I'd like to explore that a little bit through this scenario and through these next steps.
Honestly, I'm more worried about being able to pay rent than I am about being exposed to COVID-19. My partner just lost his job and I have to keep going to work.
You know, I understand that you're worried, but this is really important. Besides, if you spread the virus to others in your family, you're probably going to end up spending more on healthcare.
Yeah, but I might not even have the virus at all.
You know, if I were in your place, I'd be thinking about how bad I'd feel if I got others sick.
I mean, I guess, but like I could get evicted.
Well, maybe your workplace can give you COVID-19 compensation and you can actually enjoy being off for the next 2 weeks.
My work doesn't do that.
Oh, well, it's just 2 weeks.
Now, I want to acknowledge that of all of the scenarios that we play during this training, this is the one that strikes people as perhaps the most ridiculous. Obviously, this contact tracer was not in tune with a major concern that the contact had and a major barrier that they had to observing a quarantine. But I think the contact tracer in this case also does things that many of us do by nature, which is that when we feel someone pushing back or offering resistance, if you were, we often push back and try to convince them, try to nudge them, try to urge them to do what we think is the right thing. In this section, we're going to be talking a little bit about an alternative to that. Now, in order to talk about that alternative, I'd like to first explore what we really mean by the idea of motivation, or what motivation might look like. Imagine motivation as a balance scale. On one hand, we have reasons why it's hard to follow recommendations. In this case, for example, the contact might say, I'm really worried about my parents. I want to check on them. On the other hand, the contact might also say, I really don't want them to get sick. So they may describe things that are on both sides of that balance scale. Most people have reasons on both sides of the balance scale, and this is particularly true right now. Think about your own balance scale when it comes to social distancing. There are exceedingly few people who have only motivations to distance or not to distance. Most of us hold both at the same time. But what we express to others and what we think may be very different. Sometimes hearing people's motivation sounds like this, arguments on both sides. But more often, it sounds like this. You can't just expect me to just leave my parents with no one to check on them. Now, if you hear nothing else through this session, I want to leave you with this thought. Even if what we hear is someone making a vigorous argument against quarantine, it does not mean that they have nothing on the other side of the balance scale. Just because they express emotion doesn't mean that there's nothing on the other side of the balance scale. Even if we have motivations on both sides, if we feel pushed or trapped, we're most likely to push back. We're only going to share the motivations on that side of the scale, and we're going to weigh it down as hard as we can to fight against the person trying to convince us to do otherwise. So if trying to convince people or argue with them just makes the scale even more imbalanced, what is the alternative? How do we uncover and build on the side that leads to positive change? I'd like to suggest 4 steps to addressing this question of motivation when we feel the sense of resistance or pushback. The first is to offer a reflective statement. And again, this is something that you talked about in Wanda Jackson's session on starting the conversation. We'll review it again today. The second is to thank them. The third is to ask permission. And the fourth is to use ask, tell, ask once again, but with a slightly different twist. So let's look at the first 2 steps. When we use a reflective statement, once again, we're reflecting back to someone either the content or the emotion of what they've told us. We might say something like this. You feel a lot of responsibility for your parents. You're worried about what will happen if you can't check on them. We then thank them. When someone shares a frustration with us or even a disagreement, they're offering us a gift. They're allowing us to understand how they really feel about something. And that's a moment to offer sincere gratitude. Thank you for sharing that. Step 3, we want to ask permission to talk more about it. Would it be okay if we talk through how you might care for your parents during the quarantine period? And step 4, we want to explore their knowledge. Now, when we used ask, tell, ask, we want to explore their motivation. When we used ask, tell, ask before, we were exploring knowledge. We asked questions such as, what do you know about how to prevent the spread of COVID-19? Now we're going to turn it slightly to look more at motivation. We might ask a question such as, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to you to stop the spread of COVID-19? We're going to talk about 2 different twists, if you will, on ask, tell, ask. The first we'll call weighing pros and cons, and the second we'll call using importance and confidence rulers. Weighing pros and cons goes to this idea of the scales directly. we usually start with a question about the counter argument, if you will. What would be the bad things about sticking with a quarantine over the next 14 days? The reason we start with the negative side is that's usually what's on people's mind. We want to give them a chance to get all of that, all those reasons and all that feeling and emotion out first, and to acknowledge where they are. After we've done that, we turn to the other side of the balance scale. We might ask, what would be some good things about sticking with quarantine? There are going to be some people who will tell you nothing. But once again, once we avoid the trap of fighting back, of pushing back against people who are expressing some frustration or some resistance, we often have the opportunity to let them right the balance scale, to let them put some weight on the side of quarantine in this case, or of doing the action that's difficult. The second tool that we'll talk about is using importance and confidence rulers. Now, we talked about a confidence ruler before. If you recall, in action planning, we ask the question on a scale of 0 to 10. We're going to turn that slightly for this skill and ask on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all and 10 is extremely important, how important is it for you to quarantine? Now, once again, if they tell us it is a 10, that's fantastic. But if they describe something a little bit lower, we want to explore a little bit. So let's say they offer a 5. We might say, so why is that a 5 and not a 3 for you? Now we're giving them a chance to describe, again, why they do, in the ways in which they do have weights on the other side of the balance scale. Why do they think there's some importance to that? And then conversely, we'll turn the question around. Why do you think that's a 5 and not a 7 for you? Now, we ask about importance. We're also going to ask about confidence. And how confident are you that you can successfully quarantine? On a scale of 0 to 10. By asking about an importance and confidence ruler, we do something very important for the conversation, which is to untangle whether or not someone has the motivation to, in this case, observe a quarantine, and to untangle that from how, whether they have the resources and the plan and the ability to follow a quarantine. Those are two very different problems that have very different directions of conversation. When someone thinks that quarantine is important, but they're not confident that they can do it, you're really moving more toward the action planning world of helping them start to untangle the problem and think about what they can do to make that quarantine possible. When someone describes that they don't think it's important, it's a very different conversation that you're having. Now you're exploring what they know about COVID-19 and what information they may be missing, what assumptions they're making to start out with. So let's come back to this conversation and look at addressing the motivation done well.
You know, honestly, I'm more concerned about my ability to pay rent than I am about being exposed to COVID-19. I have to keep going to work.
So it sounds like not being able to pay your rent is really worrying you. Would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, everything just kind of gone like topsy-turvy since the pandemic started. My partner lost his job, and that was our main source of income, so I've had to pick up extra shifts.
Well, it sounds like things haven't been easy, and then on top of everything, you get a call from me.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know it's not your fault, but this really sucks.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I feel the same way. Can I ask you, what do you think would be hard about staying home for the next 2 weeks?
Ugh, that's like being out of work for 2 weeks, and so I'm missing that paycheck, and, you know, I think I'd kind of go stir crazy. I'm not really the type of person to just sit around at home.
Okay, so on top of the money concerns, it'd just be hard for you to stay at home for 2 weeks. I mean, that makes sense. Let me ask you the opposite question. What do you think might be good about completing the quarantine period and staying home for the next 2 weeks?
Well, I think I'd feel really bad if I got one of my coworkers sick. Some of them are older too.
That's a really great point. On a scale of 0 to 10, how important is it to stay at home for the next 2 weeks?
Probably an 8. I don't think I could live with myself if I got someone sick.
So it's very important for you to keep others safe. On a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you that you could stay home for 2 weeks?
Maybe a 5?
So can I ask you, why do you say 5 and not a lower number like 3, for example?
Well, I guess I'm in a better position than a lot of people.
So it's good to hear that your position isn't as challenging as many others. And can I ask, why do you think a 5 and not a 7?
2 weeks is just such a long time, and I'm so worried about money.
What do you think it would take to go from a 5 to a 6 or a 7?
I think maybe if I had some options about how to kind of ease some of those concerns that I have about money.
Sure. I mean, it can feel overwhelming. Would it be okay to talk about any resources that might help financially over the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
In this scenario, the contact had the same concern as he did in the initial scenario, but notice how very different the conversation turned out. Rather than try to argue the contact into agreement, this contact tracer took a moment and used reflective statements to express her understanding and appreciation for what this contact was going through. She thanked the contact for sharing that information. She then asked permission to explore a little bit more about the struggles that this contact was having, and used these skills around ask, tell, ask, around pros and cons and importance and confidence rulers to explore this contact's motivation. The contact in this case did have arguments on both sides of the balance scale. By asking the contact about the reasons why it would be difficult to quarantine and why it would be good to quarantine, the contact tracer offered the contact the chance to balance the scale. By exploring importance and motivation, the contact actually started to unravel the challenge that was, the contact tracer started to unravel the challenge facing this contact. Ultimately, this contact's challenge was not simply a complete lack of motivation, but deep concerns that had a lot to do with resources. And fortunately, many of you will have at least some available resources to help to connect contacts with, whether it be food resources, pharmacy delivery, or other things like that. And that's a way that you can come alongside and support the contact at that point. I want to return for a moment to our learning objectives. We've talked a little bit about the value of some of these skills and about how you might use skills such as ask, tell, ask, closing the loop, and action planning, and addressing motivation in practice. What I'd like to really focus on in these skills is that many of the verbs we've listed in these learning objectives are action verbs. They're about using, demonstrating, successfully conducting. Those are actions. While we can provide an overview of these skills today, the real ability to use them comes from practice. And to that end, we recommend that you try taking some of these skills and try them out with friends and family members. Try role-playing some of your scenarios and explore how you might use these in practice. These are deceptively simple skills. They look a lot easier than they really can feel in practice, and yet they can be incredibly powerful tools to connect more deeply with contacts, to meet them where they are in terms of their knowledge and their motivation, and to support them along the journey. So I'd like to close there and thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for the work that you are doing to protect your communities as contact tracers, case investigators.